Welcome to Faith and Science. I'm Dr. John Ashton. The debate between creation and evolution continues with a number of controversies. Of course, there is a very large view that is held widely across the community that evolution is now established as a fact. I'm reminded again that I was visiting Port Stephens on the east coast of Australia, and there was a game fishing competition, and this really large fish had been caught and was being weighed. I can't remember whether it was a marlin or a swordfish, and the commentator there announced over the loudspeaker, talking about the beautiful specimen of fish and how its ability to swim at a very high speeds was a result of evolution over millions of years. And I remember thinking to myself, this is a game fishing competition, and yet evolution is coming in and is being promulgated at that particular time. And of course, what happens is that this view then affects the interpretation that scientists put on the data and the observations that they make. And because the majority of publications, scientific publications, are holding this view, matter of fact, it would be very difficult to get a creationist science paper published in a major secular journal at the present time. Extremely difficult, if not impossible. And one of the reasons is, of course, this particular view or assumption that evolution is fact, therefore everything is interpreted, the evidence must be interpreted in that particular framework. And this makes it very difficult for creation scientists who are finding really good data to get their data out there into the general public, to get the powerful evidence that we have that evolution is absolutely impossible, and that the ages of the Earth can't be the billions of years that they claim that they are. In fact, just the other day I got an email from a friend who had just gone up to New Guinea to do some work for a few weeks, and had sent an aerial shot of some of the mountain areas as they'd taken from the light plane they were flying in. And when I looked at the shot, I could see the very steep mountain ranges, and you can see where the valleys had been eroded. But the evidence was that this was quite, really when you look at it, quite fresh erosion that had occurred. It can't be hundreds of millions of years old, yet if they dated the rocks, they would come out as hundreds of millions of years old. Some interesting things in terms of this interpretation of the data came out just last year, when there was an article published, I think it was as recently as December, or it might have been November 2019. So quite a recent report was published, and it was titled "Fossil Dinosaur Feathers Found Near the South Pole." And this was put up on nationalgeographic.com on the 19th of November 2019, an article by J. Pickrell. So fossil dinosaur feathers found near the South Pole. Now, immediately, this, says the idea that's established that dinosaurs had feathers, and therefore, this is a major missing link in the evolution of birds. And so this is sort of trying to put together the story of the evolution of birds. Because birds appear sort of fully formed in the fossil record. And so there's this claim to try and establish that the birds evolved from dinosaurs. But when we have a look at the actual data and the actual report, and we actually read through it, were they actually dinosaur feathers, and were they actually found near the South Pole? So we need to take quite careful note of this. So the title, and this is National Geographic on their site, Fossil Dinosaur Feathers Found. So this is a very strong discovery near the South Pole. So let's have a look at what actually happened. What actually happened was a research team in another paper, which was called Polar Dinosaur Feather Assemblage from Australia, and that was published in Gondwana Research, Volume 11, November 2019, by M. Kundrat and al. And what they actually found was 10 exquisitely preserved fossil feathers. Now, these feathers were only 10 to 30 millimetres long, so they were from about half an inch to a bit over an inch long. And they'd been found over a long period of time. Matter of fact, since 1962 they'd been found in the Coonawarra fossil bed. And that bed is actually in southeastern Australia. It's not at the South Pole. Where the fossils were actually found was in southeastern Australia. But you see, the speculation is that they allege that the feathers, or the fossils of the feathers, are 118 million years old. And they claim that some of them belong to ground-dwelling carnivorous dinosaurs. Now, conventionally, these fossils were found in layers that date from the early Cretaceous period. And so these scientists had this model when they believed that the land mass of Australia was joined to Antarctica before drifting north to its current location. So that's the theory there, that nearly 120 million years ago, that part of Australia, or Australia, was actually joined down to the South Pole. And so this is why in the title they have fossil feathers coming from near the South Pole rather than in Australia. And so this sort of obviously attempts, I don't know, I guess we mustn't judge motives too much, but it seems that it makes the story even more sensational. But it's fascinating, isn't it, that they've just found feathers by themselves. They haven't found them joined to a dinosaur. They've just found feathers. And what they've found them in is in southeastern Australia. And they claim that they're dinosaur feathers from the South Pole. Now, this makes it really, really hard for creation scientists as we're sifting through the research literature looking for evidence for creation. And here we find the leading journals like National Geographic, promulgating totally ideas that, as science, that really aren't based on the actual, but really aren't representing the actual evidence that they've found. So, of course, these scientists think that Antarctica wouldn't have been as cold as it is today, and they speculate that the feathers may have been important insulation, allowing small carnivorous dinosaurs to survive through difficult winter months. Now, this is a story that's been put together. So, did they actually find a feathered dinosaur? No. And it's interesting that Dr. Stephen Poropat, spelled P-O-R-O-P-A-T, a paleontologist at Swinburne University of Melbourne, he is quoted as saying, to actually find the skeleton of a feathered dinosaur here in Australia would be amazing. And so They haven't actually found a feathered dinosaur. They've just found feathers, and for some reason assumed that these feathers came from a dinosaur. And so it seems that there's this idea that birds evolved from dinosaurs, and so you have an article like this that sort of attempts to support that view. But it's really a very spurious picture, and of course they have a spurious picture of a fully feathered dinosaur drawn by an artist. And so when you actually look at the details, the scientific details, they actually do not even begin to support the idea that dinosaurs evolved into birds. They don't even support that dinosaurs had feathers. Not that the creation model rules that out. What they found, the research team actually again presented no direct evidence that the feathers did not belong to birds. Also, though, the interesting thing is that those feathers must have been very rapidly covered in sediment to preserve them, and they've been found in the sedimentary rock layer that they were found in. That particular fossil bed also contained a number of other animals. It contained freshwater ray-finned fish. It contained fossil lungfish. It contained fossils of various insects, fossils of various spider and acronid type animals, and other land-dwelling invertebrates. It had aquatic insect larvae fossils, little beetle fossils, and also fossils of horseshoe crabs. There were also plant fossils found, mosses, fossils of mosses, liverworts, fern-type plants, ginkgo, and even conifers. So fossils of all these things were found all mixed up together with these fossil feathers. And the fact that these feathers were found all mixed up really is powerful evidence for the flood, that there was some massive flood event that wiped out and mixed up all these different types of animals and buried them quickly so that they were fossilised quickly. The whole dating system as well is just automatically assumed. Of course, it's noted in one of the articles that I read, the author wrote, "This is not the first time that a National Geographic has blatantly promoted the idea of false dinosaur bird evolution." There was an Archaeoptera hoax scandal where phony dino feather fossil was reportedly dug up and published. Of course, afterwards, it was found that it was a fake, and they had to recant. And it's interesting, that article over the fake Archaeoraptor, spelled Archaeoraptor, after that hoax scandal, Professor Peter Raven, in a letter to Professor Peter Raven, who was Professor of Botany at Washington University, and he was actually chairman for the Committee of Research for National Geographic. He was a botanist, but he was sort of chairman of the committee at National Geographic at the time. And Professor Storrs Olsen, who was one of the world's foremost bird paleontologists. He'd worked at the Smithsonian Institute in the United States for many, many years, for decades. And he wrote an article asserting that the National Geographic had reached an all-time low for engaging in sensationalistic, unsubstantiated tabloid journalism, and that the idea of feathered dinosaurs is being actively promulgated by a cadre of zealous scientists acting in concert with certain editors in Nature and National Geographic who themselves have become outspoken and highly biased proselytisers of their faith. So that is direct quote, and if you're interested in that quote, quote is from a book by Alan Feducia, spelled Feduccia, who is another paleontologist specialising in the origin of birds. He's a professor at the University of North Carolina, and he wrote a book exposing the massive, unfounded speculation associated with the discovery of fossils in China and this attempt to promote this dinosaur bird evolution link. And so that quote by Storrs Olsen, and I'll read again because it's quite, it really sums up what is happening, how some scientists are really just totally promulgating their particular faith. It's not science. They're not promulgating science. They're promulgating something that they want to believe in. And so this other top professor, this is what he wrote: the idea of feathered dinosaurs is being actively promulgated by a cadre of zealous scientists acting in concert with certain editors of Nature, one of the top research journals in the world, and National Geographic, another very popular science magazine, who themselves have become outspoken and highly biased proselytisers of their faith. And notice those words there, highly biased. So they're zealous and they're highly biased. And I think this sums up the whole environment that is present in a number of research centres and universities, where they have a particular, idea that they want to push and they want to prove. And of course, creationists as well. Admittedly, we want to look for the evidence that supports creation. The problem is that creationists don't have the same, aren't getting the same media coverage for the overwhelming evidence, and I think the far superior evidence that we now have for creation. And of course, this whole bias, where science isn't really science. And I think for the average person I think a scientist, he does a result, does a measurement, and that measurement is fact. Well, in many cases when we do measurements, we get a range of values, and measurements often have to be repeated many times, instruments have to be calibrated and so forth. And a lot of research is done with instruments that aren't calibrated. It might be something as simple as a balance where they're weighing something out, or a temperature device. I remember back when I was working as a trainee physicist, we were calibrating thermocouples that were used in some experiments where we were looking at how steel stretched under high loads at different temperatures. And one of the things that we were monitoring, of course, over a long period of time was the temperature. And of course, they were very high temperature, they were measured using thermocouples. And my job was to actually calibrate and check that the thermocouples were reading correctly. And to do that, we had certain standards. One of the standards was the melting point of gold. We used to cut a little piece of gold wire and put it over the end of the thermocouple and then heat it up in a furnace. Of course, gold melts at exactly 1,063, I think, degrees from memory. And what would happen is, as the thermocouple temperature was rising, as the gold melted, because of the latent heat of fusion of the gold, there would be a little mini plateau in the calibration curve. And if that curve didn't occur at 1,063, then you knew that if it occurred when the thermocouple was, say, reading 1,040, then you knew that the thermocouple was 22 degrees out. And I can remember calibrating these, and some of the thermocouples were up to 40 degrees out. And the same goes with balances. Now, when I was working at university, I wasn't aware of any of the balances being regularly checked on a monthly basis and calibrated. Yet when I worked in another research lab as the chief chemist there and was responsible for this, we had a program where we checked the balance with standard weights that had been calibrated again against primary weights that were held by national standards in Australia. And we used to do a balance check every month on our balances. So this is the sort of level where we're looking at, and I know in a lot of commercial analytical laboratories where the results, say where the laboratories have national accreditation and would stand up in court, we have very stringent calibration for our equipment. But in other laboratories, in research laboratories, it's more or less left up to the researcher. It's interesting. This comes out a number of different results. It's interesting. For example, some years ago, a volcanic deposit in Kenya called the KBS Tuff. It's a sort of volcanic layer, which was very rich in fossils. Now, it was dated at between 212 to 230 million years old. So it's 212, 230 million years old. However, because that date did not match the fossil dating, so the fossils were thought to be much younger, the deposit was redated using different samples, and then a new age was published of 2.61 million years. And that was data that was published in Nature back in 1970. And so that new date was carried for a while. However, then the famous anthropologist Dr. Richard Leakey found a modern-looking human skull below the KBS Tuff. So that means that the skull must have been older than the KBS Tuff. And of course that being, finding a skull more than 2.6 million years old really didn't fit into the dating. It was, and in that particular layer it was found 2.9 million years. And also primitive tools were also found. So there was a lot more dating done. So subsequently a study was done by researchers at the University of California, Berkeley, again one of the top secular universities in the United States, and they redated the KBS Tuff correspondingly younger at 1.6 million years. And so that result was published in Nature in 1975. But the saga went on. But over the next 5 years, further dating studies were carried out, and the Tuff was again redated by Australian university researchers, and they reported ages 1.87 million years, 1.89 million years, which were more consistent with the ages estimated for the mammal fossils on the basis of the evolutionary timescale. So here we see a classic example of, well, hang on, we've got a scientific measurement. It doesn't fit what we want to believe because we want to believe in this particular evolutionary model. Let's redate it. And we keep redating it until we get a date that fits. And there we go. And when you think about it, the ranges have ranged from 212 to 230 million years down to 1.6 million years, and then in the end everybody's happy with the age of 1.87 million years. So there's a huge range there. I give these examples to illustrate that, in my view, a lot of this science isn't science. People have got the data, they're ignoring stuff that they want to ignore, taking on other stuff, and just when it fits and suits them. And it seems that the scientists are extremely desperate to find missing links, and that's why, finding something between the link between dinosaurs and birds, they need a missing link. They need somehow to establish how did birds evolve, where did birds come from? Because they find birds fully formed there. and we find the dinosaurs fully formed, which exactly fits the biblical model. It's very hard for creationists to get their information out there. And that's why, I'd like to remind listeners again that there are some really good websites out there with creation data on them. There's the creation.com, so just Google creation.com. That website has a very large number of articles by highly qualified scientists, fully referenced, providing the data supporting creation. Also, if you Google creation.com in 6 days as well, my book will come up there where 50 scientists explain why they choose to believe in creation. These are all doctorate-holding scientists, and each of their articles are there. They can all be downloaded or read free there from that particular site. Of course, there's other sites too, like Answers in Genesis and Creation Research Society. There are many other groups that have really, really good data there. And, of course, there's also my book, Evolution Impossible, where, again, some of the references that I've talked about today are listed there, and more details about these findings. So that's the book, Evolution Impossible, 12 Reasons Why Evolution Cannot Explain the Origin of Life on Earth. And remember, too, that you can also Google 3ABN Australia, or one word, 3abnaustralia.org.au, and click on the listen button and re-listen to Faith and Science and other episodes, previous episodes, and other radio broadcasts that are there, such as Science Conversations, where I go through each of the chapters in the book Evolution Impossible. So these resources are there to be used. They're accessible, and again, if you have friends that have doubts, tell them about these resources, because we have overwhelming evidence that the Bible account of how we came to be here is true. You've been listening to Faith and Science. I'm Dr. John Ashton. Have a great day.
You've been listening to a production of 3ABN Australia Radio.